Imagine entering a peasant household centuries ago. Romance wouldn't cross your mind. What would strike you first was how overwhelming the air felt. The air carried layers of smoke, sweat, livestock, fermenting bread, and food that had been boiling since dawn. Most homes weren't divided into rooms at all. Daily life unfolded in one shared space, built low, dark, and practical. No chimney, just a hearth in the center. People ate there, slept there, worked, prayed, and gave birth. And if you wondered where, in such a space, a couple could ever be alone, the answer was simple: nowhere. The bed, if you could call a wooden frame stuffed with hay and covered by a wool blanket a bed, usually stood in the far corner. Sometimes there was one, sometimes two, but that never meant privacy. Sleeping arrangements followed no sense of privacy. Age, illness, and family ties mattered less than simply fitting everyone inside. Livestock, goats, sheep, sometimes even chickens shared the same space, not by choice but out of necessity. It kept them safe from thieves and cold. None of this encouraged romance, passion, or intimacy. And yet, people still had to find moments of closeness. It wasn't a choice, it was part of marriage and everyday survival. Everything was done cautiously, almost in whispers, so as not to wake children or draw the attention of someone lying just a few steps away. Sometimes it happened at night when everyone was asleep, sometimes early in the morning before the household stirred. Conditions dictated the form. There was no planning, no choosing the right moment. If both weren't too exhausted, if the children stayed asleep, if the goat didn't bleat and the chicken didn't wander across the bedding, then maybe, just maybe, it was possible. On the rare occasions when privacy did exist, it wasn't seen as something special. It was another element of survival. Physical closeness served not only to produce children, but to confirm marriage, to keep a man in the household, to strengthen the union. The idea that married life might be about pleasure simply didn't dominate the thinking of ordinary people. It belonged to the rhythm of labor, something done out of necessity, not emotion. A curtain hung around the bed, if there was one at all, was a sign of wealth, affordable only to prosperous peasants or village elders. Most people simply had no way to separate themselves. Sometimes men went into the forest to cut wood, leaving women alone at home. If luck was on their side, that might buy half an hour without witnesses. More often, even those moments came with fear of being noticed by children, a grandmother, or a neighbor beyond the fence. In the nobility, things were different, but only on the surface. Yes, they had bedrooms, canopy beds, even baths on special occasions, but servants slept in those same rooms. They stood in corners, sat on chests, or lay at the foot of the bed waiting for orders. Their presence was considered normal. No one asked whether it was comfortable. No one wondered how servants felt hearing someone else's sighs. And servants were not just witnesses, they were the main carriers of gossip. Anything that happened behind closed doors quickly became public knowledge, not because people deliberately listened in, but because walls were thin and secrets spoiled faster than bread in the heat. Even castles couldn't stop whispers. In villages, rumors were stronger than truth. Travel offered no escape either. In inns or roadside lodgings, couples were usually given a shared room with several beds, often having to share a mattress with strangers. Sometimes a fellow traveler was already asleep and newcomers squeezed in at his feet. Boots stayed on. Comfort didn't matter. Intimacy in such conditions was nearly impossible. Even on the road, there was always someone nearby, a valet, a guard outside the door, a jolting cart. And in monasteries, closeness was forbidden outright, considered a mortal sin. Monks and nuns were expected to renounce the flesh. Yet human nature didn't vanish by decree. History knows many cases where high walls appeared in monastery gardens, not for solitude, but to hide what happened behind them. Desire doesn't disappear. It hides, disguises itself, comes out at night when silence becomes an accomplice. Still, despite hardship, fear, and bans, people found their way to each other. Not because duty demanded it, but because even amid smoke, cold, hay, and children snoring, affection survived. Not because conditions allowed it, but because people adopted to them. If a medieval person were asked why physical closeness existed, the answer would likely come without hesitation: to have children. That view was less personal than social. Ideas about the body, desire, and love were shaped not at home but by the church. It set the rules and boundaries. It decided when and how spouses could touch each other, and it decided strictly. Intimate life was treated with suspicion. Pleasure was seen as weakness of the flesh, and weakness as a path to sin. Even within marriage, sexual relations were allowed only for conception. Passion, enjoyment, even excessive tenderness were condemned. Church manuals and confession guides laid out in detail what was permitted and what was not, and the list was very short. First rule: not on church holidays, and there were many. Almost every day honored someone. Then came the fasts, Lent, Advent, and others. No Fridays, the day of Christ's suffering. No Sundays, the day of resurrection. Wednesdays were suspect too. When all restrictions were counted, opportunities became rare and unpredictable, often weeks apart. Even then, couples were urged to act modestly, without initiative. The approved position was the simplest one, without variation, without words or laughter. Anything resembling enthusiasm was viewed with suspicion. Enjoyment, theologians said, distracted from God. Some even claimed that desire itself could be sinful, even in marriage. A 10th century text instructed that marital relations should occur without joy, without sin, and without delay, more like a technical procedure than an expression of feeling. Women were watched especially closely. They were considered more prone to temptation, more bodily. Women were examined more closely than men, their behavior treated as something that required constant supervision, whether they were too affectionate, whether they tempted their husbands. Some even asked if pleasure was felt at all and demanded repentance if it was. Confession became a tool of control. Couples were required to describe their private lives in detail: how often, on which days, under what circumstances, whether passion crossed the line. These were not abstract talks about the soul, but interrogations of the body. Real life, of course, was more complicated. Peasants nodded, agreed, and then lived as circumstances allowed. If a husband returned from a long journey, or if a woman feared she could no longer conceive, few checked the church calendar. What mattered was not being seen. But if someone was caught, if neighbors heard sounds on the eve of a fast, there could be consequences. Women were judged more harshly. Men might be scolded, women were condemned. Punishments ranged from penance and temporary exclusion from communion to public confession before the entire village. Before marriage, closeness was even more dangerous. Relations between an unmarried woman and a man who was not her fiancé were considered a grave sin. Even mutual feelings didn't matter. Villages kept moral records and neighbors reported what they saw. Gossip turned into official inquiries. If a pregnancy followed, families intervened. Sometimes couples were forced into a corrective marriage. Honor was everything, especially a woman's. Virginity was tied to family reputation. Its loss stained not just the girl, but her relatives as well. And yet, despite fear and punishment, people still loved. They wrote notes, sang beneath windows, hid behind barns, kissed in stables, met by wells, walked under the moon, and dreamed of life together. In medieval culture, love usually came after marriage, if it came at all. Marriages were deals, not personal choices. Land met land, dowry met livestock. Parents decided. Girls rarely had a voice. A good groom was valued for a cow and a field, not for charm. A good bride for her reputation and ability to cook, not her smile. That was the worlds they lived in. Crowded, watchful, restrictive. And still within it, people reached for warmth, closeness, and each other. It was a utilitarian mindset, and it worked in a society where the main goal was survival. Love was seen as something pleasant but rare, a lucky coincidence. If, after the wedding, a couple learned to respect each other, share responsibilities, and support one another in hard times, that alone was considered good fortune. Still, courtship did exist, especially among peasants. It could be shy and cautious. A boy might bring an apple, a girl might offer nuts. Sometimes it was musical. He sang beneath her window while she listened without showing herself. Sometimes it was practical. They walked to the fields together, mowed side by side, and exchanged glances. But all of it happened under the watchful eyes of parents, brothers, neighbors, basically the entire village. One wrong word and the gossip would start. Most of the time, courtship was just a formality. Parents made the arrangements in advance, and the young people simply took part in the ritual. Sometimes a couple saw each other for the first time at the engagement, and sometimes only at the wedding. And yet, there were exceptions. There were cases where two people fell in love and refused the match chosen for them. That could spark a scandal, especially if interests of several families were at stake. Authorities might get involved, sometimes even the king, or the daughter would be labeled disobedient, the son a disgrace to his family. Songs and legends preserved a different picture, a romantic one. Traveling musicians, troubadours, and minstrels praised idealized love, a knight suffering for his lady, a lady longing in a tower, love impossible and yet eternal. These ballads were popular across all classes, especially among those who couldn't afford real freedom of feeling. In songs, love defeated duty. In life, it was usually the other way around. Sometimes emotion broke through the roles. A groom would reject a profitable bride for a simple girl, or a girl would run away with someone poor but loved. These stories happened, and people remembered them for a long time, either as courage or as madness. Some ended happily, others ended in exile, poverty, even death. But love still left traces, in songs, in tales, in whispers at the market. For those who chose marriage for love, life wasn't any easier. After the wedding celebrations came everyday reality, a cold home, hard work, little income. There was no time for romance. You had to survive, raise children, care for animals, cook, sew, pray. If spouses managed to say a kind word to each other, that was already something. If they did it every day, they were lucky. Some couples grew closer with time. They learned respect, learned to understand each other without words. They buried children together, built barns together, endured failed harvests together. Between them appeared something larger than passion, patience, attachment, quiet confidence. Ballads didn't sing about that, but those were the strongest unions. Gossip didn't break them. Illness didn't frighten them. They were held together not by desire, but by care. Of course, there were unhappy marriages too. People didn't choose personalities. A grumbler might end up with a silent one, a cruel person with a timid one, someone indifferent with someone jealous. Divorce was rare, almost impossible, allowed only with the church's permission and for very serious reasons: adultery, refusal to fulfill marital duties, danger to life. Even then, decisions could take years and didn't always favor the victim. So many stayed miserable simply because there was nowhere else to go. Women suffered more often. They were beaten, humiliated, forced to endure. They had no rights to property and couldn't leave without permission. If they ran away, they were brought back. If they complained, they weren't heard. But there were strong women too. Those who knew how to negotiate, manage a household, defend themselves with words and with a look. They were respected, even if people also feared them. Sometimes it was exactly those women who kept a family from falling apart. In the worst cases, marriage became a prison. Yet even then, some couples found a way back to each other, through years of silence, through trials, through shared labor. Not everyone, but some. And that proved something. Love isn't always a flash. Sometimes it's the ash that remains after everything else has burned. Among the many legends, myths, and museum displays connected to the Middle Ages, one of the most famous is the so-called chastity belt. In popular imagination, it's an iron device with a lock, fastened onto a woman while her husband was away. Supposedly, men going to war or on pilgrimage would lock their wives in it and carry the key to guarantee fidelity. Paintings, films, cartoons, and exhibitions have used this image for centuries. Modern historians largely agree that this image belongs more to later imagination than medieval reality. There's hardly any reliable evidence that chastity belts were actually used in the Middle Ages. Archaeologists don't find them in women's burials, medical texts don't mention them as part of daily life, chronicles are silent, and many objects displayed in museums as medieval chastity belts were made during the Renaissance or even later in the 19th century, when Victorian society, obsessed with morality, looked with fascination toward a darker past. Some were created as jokes, moral allegories, or outright fakes for collectors. Their designs are extremely uncomfortable, impractical, and dangerous to health. Wearing such a thing even for a few hours would likely cause serious skin injuries, infection, and inflammation. In medieval hygienic conditions, it would have been more like an instrument of torture than a tool of control. So if there were no belts, what kept women from cheating? The answer is simple: social surveillance, religious fear, and dependence on the family. A woman didn't need to be locked in iron. No device was needed. The structure of society itself did the work. In villages and towns, everyone knew everyone. A woman left alone was watched closely by neighbors, her mother-in-law, the blacksmith's wife, and the washerwoman who heard everything. If she went out without a head covering, if she spoke to a man at the market, if she smiled too long, it all became fuel for gossip. Rumors were punishment in themselves. They could destroy a reputation, scare away suitors from a daughter, ruin relations with relatives. A woman could lose her standing, and with it, her support. The church strengthened that control. Priests watched, questioned, punished. If a woman showed too much freedom, she could be denied communion, publicly condemned, or forced to repent in front of others. Widows and the wives of pilgrims were monitored especially closely. Officially, they were still married, but physically they were alone, seen as a potential threat to social order. Another restraint was marriage and economics. A woman usually had no land of her own, couldn't freely control property, and couldn't leave her husband without permission. She depended on his income, on relatives' help, on a priest's favor. So even if feelings faded, even if a husband was rough, many women stayed in marriage out of fear, need, and habit. And if they did cheat, it was cautiously, quietly, in secret. Of course, not everything was strict everywhere. There were exceptions, especially in cities where anonymity gave a little more freedom. Sometimes women had affairs with craftsmen, apprentices, soldiers. There were stories of unfaithful wives, secret night meetings, lovers hidden in entryways. But it was risky. That freedom could be paid for with exile, loss of dowry, and shame for the entire family. A husband could go to court, demand punishment, even seek separation if he could prove guilt. If a wife was caught, her punishment depended on her social class. A peasant woman might face public penance, a fine, or a whipping. A city woman could lose social status. An aristocrat might face divorce, banishment to a convent, loss of property. In the harshest cases, there was silent isolation when no one spoke to her anymore. Worse than a sentence, it turned her into a shadow. Men, however, were allowed much more. If a married man slept with an unmarried woman, it was considered a sin but not a crime. If he had an affair with a married woman, that was more serious, especially if her husband was powerful. Then there could be duels, scandals, poisonings, vengeful letters. But overall, men were forgiven more easily. Their affairs were treated as nature, their impulses as understandable, their adventures even as something to boast about. To manage male desire, cities created special institutions, brothels. Contrary to popular belief, they weren't always secret dens. In many European towns, they operated legally with permission from authorities. Streets were assigned, taxes were collected, rules were set. There was even a profession, brothel overseer, responsible for order, cleanliness, and safety. The church officially condemned brothels, but in practice, clergy often didn't interfere and sometimes even benefited indirectly through rents or fees. It was part of the era's strange double standard. Official morality was strict, everyday practice flexible. People knew sin was nearby and made peace with it. A brothel was seen as a lesser evil compared to adultery or violence. The women who worked there were different. Some came by choice, widows with no means or those with no other options. Others were pushed into it by economic pressure or family circumstances, and some were victims of trafficking. Their lives were not easy, but not always pure horror either. In some cities, they had access to medical checks, housing, even certain protections against violence. There were instructions on changing sheets, bathing, and limiting the number of clients per day. These measures were not created out of kindness, but out of calculation. City authorities believed it was better to control desire than to try to ban it. And that captures the essence of the era. The Middle Ages were not naive. People knew what humans wanted. They simply tried to package it into limits, strict, sometimes cruel, but functional. Hygiene in the Middle Ages is a topic wrapped in myths, misunderstandings, and smells, especially when it comes to personal cleanliness and, as a result, physical closeness. To understand the conditions of medieval intimacy, you have to forget soap bars, showers, and toothpaste, and imagine a daily life where dirt wasn't an exception, it was the background. Start with water. It existed, but not always in the right amount, and not always safe. In villages, people drew water from wells, streams, sometimes straight from rivers, where upstream they washed clothes, cleaned animals, or dumped waste. Bathing in that water wasn't just questionable, it could be dangerous. In cities, there were public bathhouses, but they weren't available to everyone, and they didn't always operate, especially during epidemics or moral restriction. Peasants washed rarely, maybe once a month, sometimes even less. Often it was for special occasions, a holiday, a wedding, childbirth. The rest of the time, they might rinse their face and hands, and if they were lucky, their feet. There was also a belief that too much cleanliness weakened the body and made it vulnerable to disease, especially cold water, which people feared like a curse. A wet body was thought to soak up illness. Soap did exist, but it was expensive. It was made from ash, fat, herbs, and lye, boiled at home or bought from craftsmen. People used it sparingly, usually only when they were truly dirty. For everyday washing, a cloth, water, and a prayer were considered enough. Among the wealthy and the nobility, hygiene was better organized. Their homes might have wooden tubs filled with warm water, often scented with herbs, mint, lavender, rosemary. After bathing, the body was rubbed with linen cloths. But even that wasn't daily, it might be monthly. Perfume was used, but it didn't replace cleanliness, it covered its absence. Scents like musk, labdanum, amber, and rose oil were meant to overpower sweat, unwashed skin, and everything else that followed a person from morning to night. Clothing made the situation worse. People wore many layers: a shirt, an outer tunic, a cloak, a hat, stockings. It kept warmth in, but it also trapped sweat, dust, kitchen fumes, and the smell of manure, something impossible to escape in village life. Clothes were washed rarely, not from laziness, but because it was hard labor. Fabrics were heavy, soap was scarce, and water was icy. Frequent washing also wore clothing out, and new garments were expensive. Shoes were not washed at all. They walked in fields, mud, and streets where waste flowed openly. People entered the home in the same boots, no slippers. Sometimes feet were wiped with a rag before sleep, sometimes not. In winter, feet were cold and smelled like old socks. In summer, they smelled worse. Now imagine the evening, a long day in the fields or behind a shop counter, sweat running under a tunic, dust and salt stuck to the skin, and all of it without soap, without a shower, without deodorant. Then comes an attempt at closeness. No candles, no clean sheets, no freshness. It wasn't a romantic act, it was a physical thing, happening inside a world of smells, exhaustion, and necessity. And yet, people didn't stop reaching for intimacy, maybe because everyone smelled the same. Teeth are another story. There were no toothbrushes. People rubbed their teeth with cloth, ash, chalk. In some regions, they chewed herbs, mint, sage, or bark. Bad breath wasn't hidden. It was considered natural. Toothache was common. Cavities were treated by pulling teeth. Herbal rinses helped sometimes, but not always. By old age, many people had almost no teeth left. Hair was washed as rarely as the body. Women covered it with headscarves, men with caps. Dandruff was seen as unavoidable. Lice were everywhere. People fought them with combs, ash, and herbal brews, or sometimes with simple endurance. If the itching became unbearable, they shaved their heads and wore wigs, especially in monasteries and at court. Dirt on the body wasn't seen as dirt of the soul. People separated spiritual purity from physical cleanliness. You could be holy and still smell like a sheepdog. What mattered was inner discipline, prayer, restraint. Monks washed the least. Some were said to bathe only 3 times in their lives, at birth, at taking vows, and before death. Holiness wasn't measured by fragrance, but by humility. There were exceptions. In southern Europe, especially in Muslim Spain and in Sicily, hygiene traditions were kept alive longer. Bathhouses existed, along with the habits of washing, oils, and aromas. But as plague spread and public hygiene collapsed, these practices began to fade. In many places, public baths were closed. First for moral reasons, the church considered mixed bathing indecent, and later out of fear of infection. During plague epidemics, people began to avoid water. They believed sickness could enter through steam. Paradoxically, people stopped washing in order not to fall ill, and that idea shaped daily life for centuries. And still, people kept falling in love, hugging, kissing, maybe because they didn't compare themselves to an ideal, but to each other. If both of you smell of smoke and garlic, at least it's equal. And in equality, strangely enough, warmth can appear, even in the dark, even in hay, even without soap. When we talk about medieval sexuality, we can't ignore magic, superstition, and the fear of witchcraft. People believed desire could be not only felt, but triggered through potions, herbs, amulets, and whispered spells. Love wasn't seen as a feeling so much as a force, something you could steer, intensify, or destroy. And often, women were at the center of it. Healers, midwives, wise women, sometimes wives who simply wanted their husbands to look at them with interest again. Love potions were a popular idea. They might be made from the strangest ingredients: dried plants, blood, honey, wax, urine, hair. Sometimes they added ash from a beloved's clothing, a clipping of a nail, or the burnt remains of a letter. It was brewed, steeped, words were spoken over it, and the mixture was slipped into wine, soup, or bread, or simply touched to the chosen person's lips. The belief was simple. After that, the person would flare with passion. Women sought these things often, especially those who feared losing a husband, suspected infidelity, or wanted to force love where it didn't exist. In towns, herbalists offered such services. In villages, there were older women with knowledge passed down through generations. They weren't called witches until something went wrong. If a man fell ill, left, or died, it was easy to blame the one who had mixed something for him. Magic in intimate matters wasn't only a women's affair. Men also turned to charms, to rekindle desire in a wife, to seduce a widow, or to cure male weakness. There were supposed remedies to strengthen desire, made from things like deer horn, eggs, or beeswax, and there were spells whispered over a bed or a belt. The church fought these practices. Any attempt to influence another person's will was treated as heresy. Punishment could be severe, from public penance to exile or even the stake if the Inquisition became involved. Using potions against someone's will was seen as especially dangerous, close to violence, even if the language for it didn't yet exist. And yet, despite threats and fear, people kept turning to magic because it offered hope. When you can't negotiate, when feelings fade, when there seems to be no other road, faith in a herb, a whisper, a secret touch becomes the last tool, especially for women who had little power, little legal protection, and few choices. There was fear of curses, too. If a man lost interest in his wife, if he couldn't fulfill his marital duty, if he grew cold, people often believed he had been spoiled. Maybe a neighbor, a jealous widow, a rejected lover had sent weakness onto him. It explained everything: infidelity, infertility, failure. And then the hunt began, searching for a culprit, interrogations, visits to the priest. If that didn't help, they went back to the same healer, this time for cleansing. There were rituals: bathing in special herbs, burning clothes, prayers spoken with hair loosened, circles of salt. People grabbed at any way to bring passion back, because passion wasn't only desire, it was proof of love, strength, a right marriage. If it vanished, something must have gone wrong. Someone interfered, or worse, God turned away. Male impotence was felt especially sharply. It wasn't just an intimate problem, it threatened authority. A husband was expected to be strong, also in bed. His ability to produce heirs, to conquer, to control, everything was tied to the body. If the body failed, the whole order trembled. So these things weren't discussed openly. They were hidden behind illness, fatigue, or magic. Women suffered too, but differently. Their desires were ignored, suppressed, labeled sinful. If a woman showed initiative, she was suspected. If she complained about a lack of closeness, she was judged. If she admitted she felt no pleasure, she was told to be silent and pray. The only acceptable script was patience. Everything else was from the devil. Still, there were secret tips and folk practices. Women shared recipes quietly. Someone would swear by a rose petal under the pillow, or milk infused with sage, or herbal tea before evening, or simply a gentle word at the right moment. Knowledge traveled in whispers, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter. No books, no speeches, only trust. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But what mattered wasn't the potion itself, it was belief. It became an act of hope. A woman stirring herbs in a pot wasn't necessarily a witch. Often, she just wanted her husband to look at her the way he used to, or the way he never had. There was no evil in that desire. There was loneliness, longing, and faith that something fragile could still be held, at least for a moment, in her own hands. The Middle Ages weren't only an age of fear, dirt, and cruelty. They were also a time when people without words and without rights still tried to feel, through herbs, through danger, through fear, but to feel. When we talk about women's lives in the Middle Ages, especially in marriage and intimacy, we also have to speak about childbirth. Bearing children was treated as a woman's main purpose, and from early girlhood she was taught that she must become a mother. But behind that idea stood pain, fear, and exhausting physical labor, often without help or compassion. Pregnancy, birth, and the weeks afterward were ordeals for which no one truly prepared women. Pregnancy was seen as a blessing, especially if a boy was born. Girls were useful, too, as future brides, helpers in the household, bargaining pieces in family alliances. But every new son strengthened the father's status and added working hands and heir. A woman who didn't produce children quickly became a target of gossip, and sometimes even a reason for separation if the husband had influence. The church might tolerate childlessness, society didn't. Medicine for women was primitive. There were no gynecologists, no modern obstetricians. There were midwives, experienced women who had attended dozens of births, who knew how to receive a baby, bind a belly, help the womb contract. Their knowledge came from practice, not books. They wore no uniforms and held no diplomas, but they were trusted with the most dangerous part of a woman's life. Birth usually happened at home, on the floor, on hay, on a wooden bench with a cutout, in a dim room that smelled of wax, blood, and vinegar. There was no anesthesia. Pain was eased with prayers, herbs, sometimes wine. Women were held by the arms. A hot stone or a pot of water might be pressed to the belly. Screaming was allowed until the moment the child appeared. After that, silence was demanded, so as not to scare the angels, as old women said. Childbirth often ended in death. A woman could lose too much blood. The womb might not contract. The umbilical cord could wrap around. If the baby got stuck, the midwife pulled as hard as she could. Sometimes metal hooks were used, sometimes crude tools, sometimes they simply waited. Some babies were born dead. Others died in the first days. The mother might die within hours from fever, bleeding, infection. If the birth succeeded, the next stage began, feeding. Breast milk was the only nutrition. There was no formula. A woman nursed herself, or if she was noble, she hired a wet nurse. Wet nurses lived in the house, fed Chuji children, and often left their own infants back in the village. It was work, income, and a burden because not every baby survived, and if a child died, the wet nurse could be blamed. Babies were baptized in the first days, often the very next day. It mattered. The child's soul had to reach heaven, even if the body didn't survive. Christenings were important events. Neighbors gathered, a chicken was slaughtered, flatbreads were brought. It was the first and possibly the last celebration in the newborn's life. Infant mortality was terrifying. Roughly 1 in 3 children died in infancy, so even strong, resilient women feared giving birth because birth didn't guarantee life. Having many children wasn't an ideology, it was a survival strategy. Not all would live, so women gave birth again and again, 5 times, 8, 10, sometimes more. There was little time between births. There were no reliable contraceptives and little understanding of how the body worked. The only protection was abstinence, and not every husband agreed to wait. A woman gave birth, recovered, and gave birth again until she couldn't. Then she might die from exhaustion, illness, wasting, or live with prolapse, back pain, and permanent damage to body and soul. And all of this happened in a world where women's health was barely spoken about. Pain was treated as normal. Suffering was seen as a required part of a woman's fate. If a woman complained, she was told, "You're not the first," or "Be quiet, God hears," or "Be grateful you survived." She washed, cooked, milked, boiled soup, still working in the 8th month of pregnancy. No one spared her. No one asked. Yet in these conditions, a kind of maternal strength was born, unromantic, unadorned, real. A woman might have no rights, no choice, no rest, but she carried the household. Without her, children died, bread wasn't baked, clothes weren't sewn. She rocked the baby, pressed it to her chest, and whispered words no one heard. And if the child lived, it felt like her miracle. Not all women suffered in the same way. Some had kind husbands, some had helpers, some had strong health. But risk was always near, and every pregnancy was like a step into darkness. Will there be life? Will there be death? Will the midwife arrive in time? Will something go wrong? Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't a union of equals. It was a contract between need and the body. The husband is provider, the wife is mother. And only in rare cases was there something more between them. Even then, feelings were quickly drowned out by reality. Need, cold, death, another pregnancy. A woman didn't choose, but she didn't surrender. She carried her fate through screams, blood, and swaddling cloths. And in that wasn't only tragedy, it was endurance. Not drama, truth. Not tears, strength. A strength no one praised, yet without it, the Middle Ages simply wouldn't have survived. In the medieval world, intimacy wasn't only about the body, it was also about the law. In every town, village, and principality, there were rules that regulated sexual relationships, what was allowed, what was forbidden, who you could love and who you couldn't. These rules came not only from the church, but from secular courts as well, and any step outside them could turn into a real tragedy. Adultery was considered a grave sin. Officially, the church condemned it for both sexes. In practice, women were punished far more often. A man might get away with confession or a fine, especially if his affair was with an unmarried woman. A woman, however, could lose everything: status, family, even her life. And if her lover was a serf, a servant, someone below her in rank, it was treated not only as sin but as disgrace to the entire bloodline. In some places, the punishments were written into law. In parts of the German lands, a woman could be beaten in public, have her hair cut off, and be driven out of town. In southern France, she might be forced to wear humiliating marks on her clothing. In Scandinavia, she could be expelled from the community. But one of the cruelest punishments wasn't a beating at all. It was silence. No one spoke to the condemned woman anymore. Even her children avoided her. Her name wasn't mentioned. It was social death, especially unbearable in a life spent among the same faces year after year. Same-sex relationships were also forbidden. The church declared them unnatural and devilish. In some regions, they could be punished by death. In others, public penance, confinement in a monastery, exile. And yet they existed. Men sought closeness with men, especially in settings like monasteries, armies, and guilds, where women were absent. There were secret bonds, hidden letters, vows made in cellars. But it all happened under fear. One exposure, and everything collapsed. Women, too, looked for closeness with women, but those bonds were interpreted differently, more often as emotional friendship. Even when there was passion, society refused to recognize it. Women wrote intense letters to each other, shared beds, exchanged rings, and many people looked away, seeing it as harmless. But in some cases, especially after a denunciation, it could be redefined as witchcraft or unclean behavior. Then came interrogations, torture, trials. The most horrifying crimes in the eyes of the era were incest and sex with animals. These acts were labeled impure and punished with particular brutality. Incest could mean burning. Bestiality could mean hanging or drowning. There were manuals that described punishments in chilling detail: how to hang, how to cut, how to brand. They weren't read aloud, but they were kept in monasteries as reminders of how far a person could fall and how far the law could go in response. Abortion was treated as murder. From the earliest weeks, a woman suspected of ending a pregnancy could face a court. Midwives who helped were risking their lives. Herbs, hot baths, strong brews, anything associated with it could be punished. Even a miscarriage could be treated like a crime if suspicion existed. A woman might be pressured into confession even if she was innocent, and if she confessed, she could be judged as a killer. Prostitution was a paradox. On one hand, it was sin. On the other, it was often treated as a necessary evil. In many European cities, brothels existed legally. The women paid taxes, sometimes went through medical inspections, answered to overseers, and still lived as outcasts. They weren't allowed to live near respectable families, weren't welcome in church, and in some places weren't even supposed to look married men in the eyes. Their children carried the same stigma. Even after leaving the trade, a woman rarely returned to normal life. Some did manage to rebuild a reputation. If a woman became a penitent nun, married a widower, or moved to another city, she might be accepted again, but always with conditions. The past didn't vanish. It whispered behind her back, passed from mouth to mouth, pointed at her in silence. The conditions around intimacy created constant tension. People lived between fear and desire, between law and flesh. They couldn't talk about it openly, couldn't ask for help, couldn't explain themselves. Everything happened on the edge, through a glance, a gesture, a brief touch. Even words of love were spoken carefully, in a whisper, under the cover of night. And still, despite bans, laws, and punishments, love survived. Somewhere in a barn, somewhere in a monastery garden, somewhere in an alley between two stalls. People root to each other on scraps of bark, left a scarf by a door, passed small bundles of herbs. They found each other even when they couldn't be together. They ran into forests, fled cities, disappeared into new villages, because love was stronger than fear. Even in a world where the body was seen as a source of sin and desire as weakness, a person still reached for another human being. They wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be held. They wanted warmth, even when it meant punishment, even when it had a price, even when people died for it. Deep inside medieval life, under the smell of smoke, dust, prayers, and fear, there was a space no one described openly, the space of quiet closeness. It didn't look like the love of nightly romances. There were no rose petals, no moonlit speeches. These were short moments of touch inside a long, heavy life. And in those moments hid the part of humanity that helped people endure. Warm, soft-spoken, almost invisible. Women didn't have words to describe desire. They weren't taught to speak about themselves, about what they wanted or what they feared. But there were looks, gestures, hands pressed together. There were nights when a husband came not to demand, but simply to lie beside his wife, to hold her, to lay a hand on her stomach. There were evenings when a woman felt not fear, but peace, and not alone could feel like a gift. Tenderness in the Middle Ages was rare, not because people didn't want it, but because they didn't know how to show it. Men weren't allowed to be gentle, women weren't allowed to be bold, but sometimes, alone behind closed doors, they dropped the masks. A man was no longer a warrior, a plowman, a judge. A woman was no longer only a hasaika, a mother, a shadow. Just two people, tired, hungry for warmth, afraid of dying without kindness. In some families, real feelings formed, slowly over years, after the burial of a child, after a hungry winter, after illness. People who began as strangers became close, not by blood, but by shared pain, not by passion, but by survival. They learned how to be together, and then love appeared not as a flash, but as a habit, like bread on the table, like the words, "be careful." Sometimes love rose between those who weren't allowed to be together, between a nun and a clerk, a widow and a servant, an old man and a young girl. These feelings had no future, but they existed. They were kept secret like a lamp in a windy night. Sometimes people wrote letters. Sometimes they only looked at each other. Sometimes they died without ever touching. Children born from forbidden passion were called illegitimate. Their lives were hard. They weren't recognized. They were mocked. Doors were closed to them. And yet some pushed through, became craftsmen, priests, soldiers. They grew up with a shadow on them, but sometimes also with love, because a mother, even rejected by society, could still be tender. There were also marriages built on partnership of minds. Few wrote about those because they didn't create drama, but they existed. Husband and wife could discuss matters, seek advice, trust each other. A woman might quietly become the family's backbone, managing money, teaching children, saving her husband from foolish decisions. Or a man might learn from his wife, trust her intuition, listen. It was a kind of silence nobody noticed, but it held the world in place. The Middle Ages knew everything: passion, betrayal, loneliness, pain. But it also knew simple kindness. Someone brings a bowl of soup. Someone mends an old tunic. Someone simply sits beside you without judging. That was love. Not the version we're used to seeing on screens, but its raw form. The desire to remain human no matter what. People didn't write treatises about feelings back then. They didn't know the word psychology. They didn't talk about trust in a couple or emotional needs. But they knew how hard it is to breathe when a child is sick. They knew how the heart freezes when a husband is late coming back from the field. They knew how the soul aches when exhaustion is heard in a loved one's voice. Those things didn't need explanations. They were lived. Sometimes a woman left a dried flower under her husband's pillow. Sometimes a man placed a piece of bread on the bench, knowing she hadn't eaten. Sometimes you just sat beside each other without speaking. And it was enough, because in a world full of danger, one thing mattered most: knowing the person next to you wasn't an enemy, that they wouldn't strike, wouldn't sell you out, wouldn't leave, but would stay. The Middle Ages ended. Centuries passed. Laws, clothes, words, roles changed. Women gained a voice. Men gained permission to be vulnerable. But that need to be close to someone who sees you, hears you, holds your hand, that remained. It's outside of time. It doesn't begin with an era. It begins with a heart. And if today we read about those women and men, if we feel for them, if we recognize ourselves in their fears and hopes, then they weren't strangers. Then what we remember isn't dates, but feelings, not wars, but touches, not kings, but those who, in the dark, whispered, "I'm here. I won't leave."